Hello again, my little yarnivores and spiderettes. Fiber Spider back again with another tutorial just for you. And today I'm going to show you actually two tutorials for the price of one. They are both using the moss stitch. Now, this first example is actually a pattern that was written by David Browning, and this is called Granny D's Moss Stitch Shawl, and the pattern is available on Ravelry. The link to that will be in the description box down below, so show your support, check it out. Now, this one is from the bottom up, so it creates horizontal stripes, and really quite simple actually. And for this example, I used Lion Brand's ice cream, and I believe this was the colorway of Parfait. To me, it really makes me think of a sunrise. It's so gorgeous. I love it. And it is very simple once you get the hang of it. Also, one thing to definitely keep in mind is that you want to use a hook size larger than what would be normally recommended. Now, for this yarn, which is a weight of 3, typically you would use probably a size H or so, depending upon your tension. Me, I broke out the big guns, and I went with a size J, so I bumped it up 2 hook sizes. So it's a 6 millimeter hook for a weight of 3 yarn. You can, of course, use what works best for you. Now, that being said, what I really like about this is that in spite of the fact that you're doing a lot of single crochets, it is very drapey, and it's not stiff, it's not curling, and I really like this stitch. So I would say, yeah, give it a whirl. Now, David, with this pattern, inspired me to come up with an alternative version, which is from the top down. And I have this right here. And so instead of creating horizontal stripes, it creates what I call V stripes because it starts at the very top and it works its way down. And I use the same yarn, different colorway. This is Blackberry in the Lion Brand ice cream yarn, and I think it's absolutely gorgeous. Yes, I'm biased, but it's just as easy, and it works up relatively quickly. And yeah, so I'm going to show you how to create both versions in this tutorial. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so first we are going to work with David's version, Granny D's Moss Stitch Shawl. And for row 1, the rows are going to be very short to begin with, but for row 1, quite simple. Start off with your slip knot. By the way, I'm using that Parfait yarn from before. And so you've got your slip knot and chain up 2. 1 and 2. And then in the first chain, 3 single crochet stitches. 1, 2, and 3. Now there's really no need to do a magic ring method because it's just the 3 stitches right there. And yeah, believe it or not, that is the end of row 1. So then for row 2, going to continue on by chaining up 1, turn the work, and so we've got 3 single crochet stitches. Now in the first stitch, 2 single crochet stitches. So right into there with 2 single crochets. Chain 1. Going to skip this next single crochet and then into the third single crochet, 2 single crochet stitches. So sometimes it helps if you turn your work just a little bit to see where you're going into. And There we go, right into there with 2 single crochets. 1 and 2. And you can cinch this up at the bottom and then sew in the end later. No big deal. And then for row 3, chain up 1, turn the work into that first single crochet stitch. Again, 2 single crochet stitches into that first stitch, chain 1, and we're going to skip this single crochet, then into the chain 1 space. Sometimes it helps if you sort of scooch your work apart just a little bit to see where that chain space is. Initially, I had to do that. Once the yarn changes color rapidly, you can see where you need to go into, so it's a lot easier. But initially, just pull it up a little bit like that, and then so you're going into that chain space with a single crochet, chain 1, skip the next single crochet, and then into the last single crochet, 2 single crochet stitches. So we've got 1 and 2. Okay, then for row 4, which is the repeat row for pretty much the rest of the entire project, chain up 1, turn the work into the first single crochet stitch, 2 single crochet stitches, chain 1, skipping that first single crochet, and then going into that chain space right there with a single crochet, chain 1, skip that next single crochet, going into the chain 1 space with a single crochet, chain 1, skip the next single crochet stitch, going into the last single crochet stitch with 2 single crochets. And there you go. Now, because the yarn really hasn't changed color yet, you don't quite get the full effect. So I would strongly recommend using a variegated yarn for this project. Over time, it will become more and more pronounced. If it is a variegated yarn that changes color very rapidly, very often, the effect will be more pronounced. If you're using an ombre, it'll be very subtle. If it's one that's more of a cake, you will have a line where you can see the little stitches, totally up to you. So, you know what? Let's keep going just a little bit longer. All right, let's keep going. All right, so let's keep going for another row or 2. So chain up 1, turn the work, and 2 singles in the first stitch, chain 1, skip the single crochet into the chain space, chain 1, single crochet into the next chain space, chain 1, single crochet into the next chain space, chain 1, and then 2 singles in the last stitch. Chain 1, turn the work, 2 singles in the first stitch, chain 1, single crochet into the chain space, chain 1, single crochet into the next chain space, chain 1, single crochet into the next chain space, chain 1, single crochet into the next chain space, chain 1, and then 2 singles in the last stitch. And that's really all there is to it. Now, you can keep going as long as you want, until your piece is as big as you want it to be. Then what you can do for the finishing row for your edge is chain up one, turn your work, 2 singles in the first stitch because you want to keep that increase going. Then for every single crochet and for every chain space, do a single crochet. So instead of skipping ahead and instead of chaining, I just did my 2 singles. So then a single crochet into the next single crochet stitch, then 1 into the chain space, and then into the single crochet stitch, and then into the chain space, into the stitch, into the space, into the stitch, into the space, into the stitch, and yeah, into the space, almost missed it, sorry, and then into stitch, and then 2 single crochets into the last stitch. And if you're feeling adventurous, you could always do single crochets all the way around. As David said in his pattern, it is an optional thing. Personally, now this is personal opinion, I wouldn't, only because then the color going along this side and this side, if you have stripes going on with your variegated yarn, you would then break up those stripes with this edge and with this edge. That's just, aesthetics. That's my personal opinion. That's totally up to you. However, that is how you would go about Granny D's moss stitch shawl. Okay, so again, thank you, David, for inspiring me and letting me use your pattern. Now, we're going to hop on over to my own version, which is the top-down version. Alrighty, so let's hop to it. Okay, so for the top-down version, row 1, I'm going to be using the same yarn. And in this instance, yes, we're going to start with a slip knot, of course, and begin with a chaining of 2, 1 and 2, and then into this first chain, we need a total of 5 single crochet stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And of course, yes, you can cinch this up later, so in your end, no problem. Then for row 2, chain up 1, turn your work, and then into the first stitch, 2 single crochet stitches, chain 1, skip the next stitch going into that third stitch with 3 single crochets. So right into there with 3 singles, 1, 2, 3, chain 1, skip the next single crochet going into the last single crochet with 2 single crochet stitches. And again, yes, sometimes it helps if you just sort of turn the work just a little bit, at least initially, until your stitches become a bit more established. So 2 singles in this last stitch. And cinchy, there you go. And then for row 3, chain up 1, turn your work, and into the first single crochet, 2 single crochet stitches, 1 and 2, chain 1, skipping that next single crochet and doing a single crochet into that chain space, chain 1, skipping that first right there because we have our 3 up top here. So skipping the first, going into the middle one with 3 single crochets. 1, 2, 3, chain 1, skip the next single crochet, going into that chain space right there with a single, chain 1, skip the next stitch going to the last with 2 single crochet stitches. Okay, and that's really all there is to it. So let's do a couple of repeats, shall we? Alrighty. Okay, so moving right along. Chain up 1, turn your work into that first stitch, 2 singles, chain 1, skip the stitch going into the chain space with a single, chain 1, skip a stitch going into the space with a single, chain 1, skip a stitch going into that top center stitch with 3 singles, chain 1, skip that stitch going into the space with a single, chain 1, skip the stitch going into the space with a single, chain 1, skip a stitch going into the last with 2 singles. All right, chain 1, turn the work, 2 singles in the first stitch, chain 1, single in the chain space, chain 1, single in the chain space, chain 1, single in the chain space, chain 1, single in the middle, that second stitch, 3 singles into that second stitch. 1, 2, 3, chain 1, single into the chain space, chain 1, single into the chain space, chain 1, single into the chain space, chain 1, and then 2 singles in the last stitch. Let's do one more. Let's live dangerously, shall we? Chain 1, turn the work, 2 singles in the first stitch, chain 1, and then single in the chain space, chain 1, and then single in the chain space, chain 1, single in the chain space, chain 1, single in the chain space, chain 1, 3 singles in that second single, chain 1, single in the chain space, chain 1, single in the chain space, chain 1, and so forth, and so on. And then when you reach the end, 2 singles in that last stitch. Now, if you want to do the edge of just solid single crochet stitches like I showed you before, there's a very slight variation. I mean, you're chaining up 1, 2 singles in that first stitch, and then single in the single, right? And then single in the chain space, single in the single, single in the chain space, single in the single, single in the chain space, single in the single, single in the chain space, single in the single, single in the chain space, single in the single, and then on that top one where you do your increase, keep doing the increase. So it's going to be 3 singles in that top stitch, and then single in the single. There we go. Single in the chain space, and so on and so forth, just following suit with what you had been doing. Now, that's pretty much all there is to it for this version as well as the previous version. Now, something that can work in the other version, but not this version per se, I'm going to mention to you. Just give me one moment. Okay, so now, if you want to do the bottom-up version of this shawl, one thing that you could quite conceivably do is you could have it be the ultimate stash buster. Yep. What you could do is after every row, change yarn. Now, of course, I would suggest using the same weight of yarn, but as far as color is concerned, go absolutely crazy. Make this your stash buster piece. So how I would do it is do, your, I would say maybe do maybe like 2 rows, okay, just so that you have something established, and then cut your yarn and start your new row with your new yarn, and then at the end of the row, cut your yarn. At the beginning of the new row, start with some new yarn. And what you would do, I'm not going to actually show you how to do this. This is more like, an idea for you if you so choose to do so. You would keep those tail ends sticking out of the sides of your piece. And those would be like fringe for you. And you wouldn't have to sew them in, which is a huge bonus. I'm sure you can vouch for that. But what you would do is you would tie a knot with both of those ends so that the ends are just going to be hanging, like fringe, and you won't have to sew in the ends, and you would have 2 ends on either side per row, okay? And what I would suggest, though, let me see if I can find some scrap yarn here. 1 second, I'll be right back. Okay, so when you have your ends, just have some scrap yarn here. When you have your ends, sticking out from the side of your piece at the end of the row, what I would not suggest doing is doing a typical knot, where you're going like this and then going like this and then tying your knot like that. I wouldn't suggest it only because then the ends will be going in different directions. No, what I would suggest, now I was never a Boy Scout, I'm sure you can imagine. So I don't know the names of the knots. I think that was a square knot, I think. What I would suggest doing is to do this kind of knot where you're holding these two together and then making them into a knot, having the knot as close to the edge of your project as possible. That way, the ends are together, okay? And if you change your yarn colors every row, you will have a lot of little ends sticking out from the edges of your piece. And if that's the look you're going for, not only could it create some really beautiful fabric, it could be a great stash buster, and it could also add a little bit of fringe to the sides of your piece. Now, it would work with this version. However, it wouldn't work with the other version only because the ends would be along the top edge. So unless if that's something you're going for, it wouldn't be along this edge and this edge, it would be along the top edge. So if you want to try the stash busting technique that I mentioned, personally, I think it would only work best for this particular version. But again, it is merely an idea that I wanted to share with you. So that being said, I want to thank David for, like I said, giving me access to his pattern and giving me the inspiration to come up with one of my own. And like I said, also, please do check that out on Ravelry. The link to that will be in the description box down below, as well as his YouTube channel. He does a lot of really neat videos, a lot of live streams and interviews. Go check him out. And until next time, I'm going to keep working on these because for the thumbnail, I wanted to fit them both in the same picture. So I'm going to make mine a little bit bigger, and I'm just going to keep going and see how it looks. So until next time, my dears, I want all of you to stay inspired, stay caffeinated, stay stitching, and please stay safe. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you in my next video. Bye for now, everybody, and have a good day.